Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again.
Okay, so this is a book review of Archives, Principles and Practices by Laura A. Millar.
Okay, so just to give a quick overview, this is a book I've been meaning to cover for some time now, and it's, in my opinion, one of the best introductory books about archival practice there is. The book was originally published in 2010 and then again in 2017. I'm reviewing the second edition here, but I do actually have a copy of the first, and I recommend that one too. Laura Millar is an archivist based in North America with over 30 years experience working in other countries. So I think I read that she had experience working in France and basically a multitude of countries around the world. She's worked as a consultant for various organisations, and she's actually published other works. Her book, the one I'm reviewing, the Principles and Practice book, won the Society of American Archivists 2011 Waldo Gifford Leland Award. So in sum, this book is written in very clean language. It discusses various concepts in modern practice in a very understandable way. And I personally found this book really useful as a student and an early professional, and I still keep a personal copy. And lastly, just a note, I should also emphasise that this review is not a substitute for reading the book. Although I will give an overview of what it contains, I highly recommend buying the book if you're able to do so, or borrowing it if you're able to do so as well. Okay, so the book has 12 chapters which are split into two sections. The first of these sections is about archival principles. So what are archives? This is the first chapter, and this chapter defines what archives are and also discusses archives as scientific and physical evidence. The nature of archives chapter builds on this and also discusses the form archives can take, in addition to other topics such as archives as art or artifacts. The archival history and theory chapter discusses trends in archival history and offers a brief discourse on archival theories, and also includes a part about challenging archival theories, which I thought was quite cool. For example, Millar explores the concept of multiple provenances, which is a lot more common, which I found to be a lot more common than the other literature suggests. And she also talks about some of the issues with the concept of the fonds. So if you're not aware of what I mean by that the fonds, the idea that one collection is complete, she talks about some of these issues as well, which I thought was quite interesting. The uses of archives chapter discusses archives as sources of history, tools for accountability, and touches on memory and identity. Types of archival institution literally discuss the different types of archive that exist, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail next. The principles of an archive service chapter is quite interesting as well. So this one touches on the role of the archivist, the role of the professional associations, the place for standards, and the sort of respect and moral issues. And the final chapter in this section discusses the balance between privacy and access. I personally think topics such as these are of increasing relevance, especially with legislation such as GDPR, and even just sort of more moral debates around topics such as the right to be forgotten. Okay, so naturally I can't discuss every chapter in great detail, but one chapter that really jumped out at me was on the different types of archive. That one really caught my attention, and it's worth noting that different types of archives do exist. That was the one thing that was maybe the one big myth or misconception that I had when I entered the profession as a student years and years ago, was that you have different types of archival institution. So here Millar talks about institutional archives, hybrid archives, collecting archives, community archives, museum archives, integrated institutions, indigenous archives, activist archives, online repositories, and trusted digital repositories. And I should note that all of these categories, they're not all mutually exclusive. You might find that there is some overlap between them. For example, you may have a collecting archive that also has an online repository. There can be intersections. And I found it particularly interesting when she discussed Indigenous and community archives, which are beginning to capture their own histories, which can include preserving artifacts more broadly, including objects and other materials. She also briefly discusses how institutions can be increasingly multifaceted and can also include a museum, a library, or even undertake education work. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it kind of backs up an idea I've had for a long time that archives can be very dynamic. They're not just a sort of passive place where old records are kept. They can play an active role in lending materials or providing educational services. So I really, really enjoyed reading that. And I also noticed that she discussed digital record keeping developments, especially the concept of trusted digital repositories. So here Millar noted 3 types of digital repository and discussed each of their features. Digital preservation, and just more generally, is very easily a book on its own. In fact, there's many books about digital preservation, and this part of the book was a really good introduction to some key concepts relating to digital preservation. So that chapter for me really stuck out to me. There was a number of chapters in that first section that I really enjoyed, but this one caught my attention particularly. Okay, so the second section relates to archival practices. So the book's titled Principles and Practices. The first section was about principles. The second section is about practices. And here, as you can imagine, the book becomes a lot more practical. Managing the institution chapter indicates how an archive service may be structured, administered, and what the measurements of success may be. But as mentioned, that will probably vary by different type of archive. But she does sort of give a sort of broad overview of what that might look like. Preserving archives is highly practical and discusses hazards, different types of media, and also touches a little bit on digitization, which again could easily be a book on its own. And again, actually, there are several books specifically about digitization, but she does talk about it within a sort of preservation context, which is quite interesting. Acquiring archives discusses appraisal, dealing with donors, the process of acquisition, and also includes some content and personal bias, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think that is that's quite cool that she's mentioned that. That's not always came up in the literature, but it is worth mentioning that although you can try standardise archival practice as much as possible, human instinct and human bias will naturally come in at any stage in a process. And I found it quite refreshing that she recognised that. Arranging and describing archives and notes principles, language and practicalities. I'm going to discuss this chapter in a little bit more depth in the next slide. And making archives available talks about providing access, establishing a reference service and outreach and community engagement. And finally, she finishes with a conclusion where she warns of the dangers of what she calls temporal chauvinism, which I thought that was a fantastic term. It's a type of elitism where you value your own contemporary practices and achievements above all else that went before. I think this is a really good point and something worth keeping in mind. There's a quote I like, which I think says something like the past is a foreign country, which I think is also the title of a book. And I think it's something worth keeping in mind when looking at older practices. Okay, so the chapter in section 2, which interested me the most, was the one about arranging and describing archives. Here, Millar discusses the principles of arrangement and description, custodial arrangement and description, functional arrangement and description. She discusses various practicalities, controlled language, and she gives some sample descriptive output. This is a really instructive chapter if you're new to cataloguing or new to describing archives. This chapter is a fantastic place to start. In fact, I've recommended this chapter to people who are cataloguing for the first time. She gives really useful examples of hierarchical descriptions also. So she gives an example of a description at funds level all the way down to piece level. If you're wondering what piece level is, that's a sort of level that exists now below item level, and I thought it was quite interesting that she recognised that. I've only seen that in a handful of other books, so it was quite cool that she noticed it. And she also touches on the use and importance of language. She gives a really interesting example as well from Canada about a project to replace Western place names with original and more authentic Aboriginal names, which I find quite interesting. And I think projects such as these, I think, are going to become a lot more common in years to come. And it's worth considering how we can make our more descriptions more inclusive and authentic. And I found it quite interesting that she touched on that. Within that chapter, and it's worth mentioning this book was written in 2017. I think that I think that those issues were very topical then, but they're even more so now. So in that respect, I think many, not just this topic, but I think many of the themes and things she writes about, I think are going to increase in sort of relevance to archivists as time goes on. Okay, and I was also very fortunate to have a conversation with Laura Millar herself, and she very kindly added the following context to her book. So, for example, she noted that she thinks there is likely to be less of a hierarchical approach to arrangement and description in a digital age. I think this is probably accurate, and I think a lot of the focus in the future will probably be more in capturing structured metadata, which can become keyword searchable. So I think that's probably quite true. Another piece of context she provided was that the inclusion of Australian approaches to arrangement and description, for instance, came out in part because she was able to visit some colleagues in Australia, and they had a number of conversations that helped her understand the series system and the continuum. Just a quick note, I think this is such a good lesson. I really do feel that as an archivist, you should be willing to be flexible and adaptive. And I think learning new ideas by having conversations with others is a really fantastic way to look at your practices and think about how you can add to it. And lastly, discussions around privacy, GDPR and bias, according to Laura, are more prominent now than they were when the second edition was published in 2017. Laura added that we are very much remiss if we don't take time to understand the context in which materials were created, used and kept, and that we also rely on laws, regulations, codes of ethics and statements of professional practice to help her overcome our personal perspectives and focus on ethical and professional responsibilities. And I think that's quite a good point. One very additional thing, I actually made a small typo in my first draft. I think I described the books as practice instead of practices, and she pointed out that it really is practices because there are a multitude of methods and ways. So I thought that was important to point out. Okay, and finally, just some conclusions. So overall, this book offers a fantastic mixture of practical and theoretical content. The language is really clean, direct and simple, which I think helps a lot. I think she touches on some highly relevant and topical issues, especially around how archives can be more inclusive in their practices. Millar also starts the book, I think, with a fantastic metaphor about a girl who can't understand why her mother cooks a roast in a certain way. Her mother says it's because it's always been done that way, and that's the way the mother learned from the grandmother and so forth. And the daughter later finds out that the reason the original method was chosen was due to a now no longer relevant logistical challenge, such as the way cookers are shaped, for example. The metaphor basically indicates the need to consider our own practices in a modern era. Personally, for example, there are things that I've looked at that I'm not so sure are as relevant today as they once were before. So, for example, today, I wonder if there should be as much focus on physically sorting catalogues. With keyword searchable catalogues, I'm inclined to wonder if we should place more emphasis on descriptions rather than physical sorting. Because as I say, people I don't think navigate catalogues quite the same way they did maybe as little as 10 years ago. So that's just an example of something that sort of, something that metaphor, that was an example of a thought that metaphor sparked to me. And lastly, this book has an outstanding glossary of terms, which I also think is very, very helpful. So again, if you're new to archives or you're new to the profession, the glossary of terms is very, very useful, and I would thoroughly recommend it. So overall, I really recommend this book. Any comments or questions would be more than welcome. Otherwise, thanks again for listening. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.